For this course, we will be using the textbook Myth and Knowing. And I hope that right away you notice that the subtitle for this book is An Introduction to World Mythology. So many of us are more familiar with some of the Western myths, the Greeks and the Romans and so forth. But in this course, we're actually going to be looking at myths from across the globe, maybe some that you're not even familiar with yet. So maybe you've just previously thought about myths as stories about gods and the exploits of heroes. But in this course, we're going to be thinking of it as a way in which human beings can orient themselves to the world. And myths answer these age-old questions. Where do we come from? What's our purpose? What happens after we die, etc. So I'm hoping that through the study of these myths, we can see these diverse cultures wrestling with these fundamental questions, and then we can attempt to come to some sort of understanding about the nature of the divine, the nature of the self, and the obligations we have to others. So, despite this idea that there is some sort of a universal linkage between all of these myths of the world, it's also important to remember that they also communicate a culture's unique history and qualities. So we're going to be looking at those. So it's not enough just to consider the big picture, but to look at what do the myths tell us about specific groups of people. For example, your book points out in the preface on page 7 that Native American myths tend to dramatize the idea that everything is intelligent, that the human being is related to brothers bear and fox as well as the rocks, while the Egyptian and classical accounts talk about human creation in terms of various gods giving order to the cosmic chaos and so forth. So all cultures tell stories of origins, but the conceptual architecture built upon these foundational accounts is different. And that's what we're going to be looking at. What are the differences among these myths and these cultures? And why is it exactly that we are studying them? Why do we as human beings want to know? So Carl Sagan and Andrew put it this way: we have not met our forgotten ancestors, but we begin to sense their presence in the dark. We recognize their shadows here and there. They were once as real as we are. We would not be here if it were not for them. Our natures and theirs are indissolubly linked despite the eons that may separate us. The key to who we are is waiting in those shadows. So what I want to do in this lecture is to go through the history, the background of how we've come to, how we used to look at myths and how we look at myths today. Just what's the progression of that. Okay, so we want to start with, and I'm on your book, again in your book on page 2. This English word that we have, myth, derives from the Greek word mythos and has been distinguished from the Greek word logos, which means word or story. So there's a difference. The mythos was supposed to be divinely inspired poetry. Okay. So you can see the power and the beauty of the language is really supposedly what sets these apart. And that's originally how this idea of myth was looked at. Of course, in all languages, the meanings of words change. And around 500 BCE, Heraclitus wanted to talk about how he saw that this idea of myth was just false, and he thought he sneered at the people who believe these types of crazy ideas. How could gods live up in the sky? He found it to be almost embarrassing that people would hold to these ideas, to believe in these fanciful tales. Heraclitus instead thought we should focus on the logos, on the rational ideas, the everyday things that we could observe. Then about 100 years later, Plato comes along and further denigrates this term mythos. He thought it should just be synonymous with falsehood, and in some instances that still holds true today, that people when talk about myths are talking about things that are not true. Wanted to clarify the idea of myth and what it meant. And as your book says, the myths that Plato didn't like, the ones created by other people, were lies, and the myths that he liked, or he created himself, were truths, which again holds some status today in the way that we think of things. Anything that you don't believe is a myth, and anything that you do you can view as your belief system or your religion, perhaps. So these are some ideas that he held and actually changed for a long time the idea and the power of the myth. Like Heraclitus and Plato before him, Euhemerus was also a doubter of the myth's true value. He thought that it lacked scientific method and philosophical principles, and it was just superstition and exaggeration. So he claims to have taken a journey across the Indian Ocean to the land of Pangaea, and there he read an inscription which stated that Kronos and Zeus were at one time living kings on Earth. So that seems especially strange to us, but he wanted to put the myths in the realm of the historical to show that perhaps there was some version of these great figures that in fact lived upon the earth once upon a time. Then Hesiod comes along, and he wants to breathe new life into this idea of myth, and he creates what's often called the golden age of myth. He wrote about these gods on Olympus, and he wanted to find an attachment to a time when things were better, when life was golden, when mortals were living in harmony with the world and each other, and there was not any suffering. Sound familiar? Don't people still long for a time when they think that things were better, more perfect than they are now? That's always been the case. People have always had a longing, a romanticism about days past. Early days of the Christian church, they specifically wanted to demonize these ideas that these terrible gods and goddesses with so many monstrous adventures. So they want to flip the terms. They want the term logos to mean transcendent truth. So instead of just the everyday language that that word originally meant, now you have this famous line in the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, or in their translation, logos, and the logos was with God. And the God became flesh, so the Word becomes flesh. So here you have this new divine association with logos, which pushed away the idea of mythos and actually had quite a huge impact. It had the idea of myths had a negative connotation for almost 1,500 years. They gained traction again at the end of the Renaissance period, when people were more interested in finding out what their origin stories are. What are our roots? What can we trace our ideas back to? And so one important figure in this time, and it talks about him in your book on page 7, Gottfried Herder, had this theory about ethnicity and folksiness and so forth, and he wanted to find the ideas behind that in the use of myths, and he thought that they were fascinating stories, and he wanted to find connections between those and people living today. Now, that kind of took a dark turn. Your book describes that, about how the Nazis sort of latched onto that, trying to say that one specific race was superior to another. So it wasn't as lovely as this scene of culture depicts, but he does bring back to the forefront this idea of myth. At the end of the 19th century, James Frazer took an entirely different approach to mythology. In his book, The Golden Bough, he wanted to look at the function of living societies and actually examine myths through an anthropological lens. He looked at it as primitive science and a way for simpler people to be able to explain phenomena that they didn't have science to do for them. So he wants to examine myths through this way of looking at the culture of a people. 20th century brought a huge emphasis on the idea of psychology. In fact, what we know as psychology today was actually invented by Sigmund Freud, who wanted to tap into what he termed the unconscious mind. And so he and Carl Jung began to investigate this relationship between myth and the unconscious. And they thought that these mythic symbols, these larger than life ideas that they encountered in religion and in mythology, were works of the imagination, and that when you started tapping into those through dreams, that you could get into the deepest wells of the psyche. Jung even took it a little farther and argued that there are mythic archetypes that work across cultures and civilizations, and he thought a healthy mind would have a balanced idea of these archetypes, and an unhealthy mind, as you can imagine, just the opposite. Until the 20th century brought about a new figure, often called the best-known mythologist of the 20th century. And this is Joseph Campbell. He did quite a series of books and films examining all of these ideas of where myths come from, how we should see them, what they mean to us today in our world. Acknowledged his indebtedness to Freud and Jung, but he disagreed with them, especially about the archetypal symbols. He thought that mythology was a vehicle through which an individual can find their own sense of identity and place in this world. So the way that we've looked at myths has changed over the millennia, but for this course, we're going to look at these different myths through this set of lenses. And this is on page 23 of your book, where this is adapted from William Doty's Toolkit, which is a way to think about myths in different ways. So what we're going to be examining is the myths through a social lens, a psychological lens, a literary, textual, and performative lens, a structural lens, and a political lens, because it's through a mixture of these that you can find the most, I think, to get the most meaning from each of these myths. Now, obviously, we won't be doing all of these for all of them, but you will see that some of them actually lend themselves more to one idea than another. So your book is divided into 5 major sections. We're going to be examining 4 of those. This is how they've chosen to divide up the types of myths, and it makes the most sense because they fall into a category. Most myths have a major bent. So the myths that we're going to be looking at are the myths of creation, the myths of the feminine, the myths of the masculine, and the trickster myths. Each of these sections begins with an introduction to the type of myth that it is, but it also offers some great ways to specifically look and compare at the myths. So don't miss the introductions. They're going to have some important ideas about the lenses through which you'll read the myths, and then each section has a series of myths from literally all over the world for each of these. If you remember, my opening slide talked about how we just sense our ancestors. You remember how in my opening slide we talked about how we just sense our ancestors in the dark, and how perhaps we are curious about those who came before us, and we know that what we have now would not exist, or who we are would not be, if it hadn't been for those people. So I want to look now at a current writer who reminds us that one of the reasons why religion seems irrelevant today is that many of us no longer have the sense that we are surrounded by the unseen. So she's saying the opposite, that maybe we've forgotten to look beyond what's just right in front of us. Our scientific culture educates us to focus our attention on the physical and material world in front of us. This method of looking at the world has achieved great results. No one can argue with that. One of its consequences, however, is that we have edited out the sense of the spiritual or holy which pervades the lives of people in more traditional societies at every level, and which was once an essential component of our human experience of the world. So, in other words, she's not calling these people foolish or backward. She's saying they had a way of looking at the world, and sometimes it was through these stories and these myths, and so that maybe we have something to learn by also rediscovering these fabulous tales.